The match was already lit when Clyde Donovan stepped through the door of the abandoned Covington homestead and found a woman sitting at the old kitchen table, bent over paper and ink, writing like the devil himself was chasing her words across the page. He stopped dead in the doorway, the small flame burning down toward his fingers, the bundle of letters clutched in his left hand, and he stared at her like a man who has walked into a room expecting to find a ghost and found instead someone far more terrifying. A living, breathing, entirely real woman who had not looked up from her work even once. She wore a dark green dress, dust-hemmed at the skirt, her brown hair pinned loose at the back of her neck, a few strands falling forward as she wrote. The oil lamp on the table threw amber light across her face, catching the furrow in her brow, the deliberate press of her lips as she formed words he could not read from where he stood. The match burned his fingers. "Damn," Clyde muttered, shaking it out, dropping the charred stick to the porch boards, and the woman finally looked up. She did not scream. She did not reach for anything. She simply looked at him the way a schoolteacher looks at a student who has walked into the wrong classroom, with mild surprise and the faintest edge of inconvenience. "You are standing in my doorway," she said. "I am," Clyde said, "though I was under the impression nobody lived here." "I live here," she said, setting her pen down on the inkwell rest with perfect calm. "I have lived here for 6 weeks." Clyde looked at the bundle of letters in his hand, and then looked at her, and then looked at the letters again. The envelope on top read, in small, precise handwriting, "To anyone who finds this place and knows what it once was." "Are you Gertrude Covington?" he asked. She tilted her head. "Who is asking?" "My name is Clyde Donovan." He paused. "I rode out here on behalf of your brother." Something moved across her face then, something quick and private like a cloud crossing sun. She straightened in her chair and folded her hands over the pages on the table and said, in a voice that had gone carefully quiet, "My brother sent you to burn them." It was not a question. Clyde set the unlit bundle on the small shelf beside the door, the one where old Martin Covington had once kept his pipe tobacco, according to every person in the town of Harlan Creek who had ever spoken of the man. "He said the house was empty," Clyde said. "He said the letters were old. He said burning them would be the cleanest way to settle the estate." "The estate," Gertrude repeated, and there was something in the word, a dry, worn-out bitterness like leather left too long in the weather. "My father's land, my mother's kitchen table, 6 generations of correspondence from people who built this valley with their bare hands. He wants to burn the estate. He wants to sell the land," Clyde said carefully. "He wants nothing attached to it." "Nothing inconvenient, you mean?" She looked at him steadily. Her eyes were a particular shade of gray that he was not prepared for, not flat gray, not cold gray, but the gray of water before a storm, full of movement underneath. "And what do you want, Mr. Donovan?" He leaned against the doorframe and considered the question longer than was perhaps polite. The year was 1878, and the territory of New Mexico was not a place that rewarded men who thought too long before answering. But Clyde Donovan had spent enough years making quick decisions that led to poor outcomes that he had developed a habit of deliberateness that most people read as slowness and he read as survival. "I want to understand what I rode 3 days to do before I do it," he said at last. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Sit down, Mr. Donovan. I will make coffee." He had not expected that. He sat down. The kitchen was worn but not broken. Someone had recently cleaned it. The hearthstone was swept. The windows were wiped clear of the fine red dust that coated everything in this part of the territory, and a small jar of dried desert sage sat on the windowsill in a way that was deliberate, not accidental. There were books stacked on the side counter, dog-eared and well-read. There was a blanket on the wooden chair near the fire that had been folded neatly and was clearly being used at night. The house breathed like it was lived in. Gertrude moved to the fireplace with the efficiency of a woman who had made coffee in difficult circumstances more than once. She was, he guessed, somewhere in her late 20s, 27 or 28, with the kind of composure that is not the same as youth and not the same as age, but something in between that is earned. She was not pretty in the way that saloon paintings were pretty. She was pretty in the way that things built to last are beautiful substantially, without apology. "How do you know my brother?" she asked, keeping her back to him as she worked. "I don't particularly," Clyde said. "I've done work for him twice before. I carried a deed to Taos for him last spring, and before that I tracked down a stray herd that wasn't his but that he'd filed on. I'm a courier mostly. Sometimes other things. What other things? Depends on what needs doing." She came back to the table with 2 tin cups and set one in front of him. The coffee was dark and strong and smelled like the best thing he had encountered in 3 days on the trail. He wrapped both hands around the cup and said, "Thank you." She sat across from him. In the lamplight, he could see now that the pages spread before her were not one letter but many, accumulated over the course of what looked like a long evening's work. The handwriting was small and exact, and the pages were covered corner to corner. "What are you writing?" he asked. She looked down at the pages. "Everything I remember," she said. "Everything that happened in this house. Every story my father told me, every letter my grandmother sent from Virginia before the war, every—" She stopped. She picked up her pen and set it back down. "The house is being sold. I know that. I'm not a fool, and I am not here to fight what cannot be fought, but I refuse to let it all simply disappear." Clyde looked at the stack of letters on the shelf, the ones he had written out to burn. "Those letters," he said. What are they?" "Family correspondence," she said, "spanning 30 years. My grandmother's letters to my father when he first came west. My mother's letters to her sister in Charleston. My father's letters to the land office, to neighboring ranchers, to the governor's office regarding water rights." She paused. "And letters my mother wrote to my father when he was ill in the last year of his life, that he never read, because she could not bring herself to give them to him while he was dying, and afterward she kept them because that is what you do." The fire crackled. Outside, the New Mexico night pressed against the windows, vast and indifferent. Clyde drank his coffee and listened to her breathe and thought about the match he had already struck once tonight. "I won't burn them," he said. She looked at him. "I'm not going to burn them," he said again, more firmly, as if he was settling something with himself as much as telling her. "Your brother can find someone else for that particular errand." Something shifted in her face, not relief exactly, more like the unwinding of a tension she had been holding for so long she had stopped noticing it. "That will cost you work," she said. "He will not pay you." "He hasn't paid me yet anyway," Clyde said. "He tends to pay on completion, and I find I'm not completing this particular task." Gertrude Covington looked at Clyde Donovan across her mother's kitchen table with the lamplight between them and the letters behind him on the shelf and said slowly, "Why?" He thought about it. He was an honest man by habit, if not always by inclination. "Because it's wrong," he said, "and because you were sitting here writing them new ones, and that seemed to me like something worth paying attention to." There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. Then Gertrude said, "Where are you sleeping tonight?" "I hadn't thought past the burning," he admitted. "The barn is sound," she said. "There is hay. The creek is 200 yards east if your horse needs water. That's very generous." "It is also very practical," she said. "You are one man and you are tired and you have a horse that needs rest before a 3-day ride back. There is no point in your leaving tonight." She paused. "Besides, I want to know exactly what you are going to tell my brother." Clyde set down his cup. "I suppose that is a conversation worth having." "Tomorrow," she said, and returned to her writing. He took his horse to the creek, and then to the barn, and unsaddled her properly, brushed her down in the dim starlight coming through the barn's open door, and spread his bedroll on the clean hay, and lay there for a long time listening to the night sounds of the territory coyotes far off, a whip-poor-will somewhere in the scrub oaks, the creak of the old house settling in the cooling air. He thought about Gertrude Covington's gray eyes and the way she wrote like she was racing against something. He thought about her brother, a man named Harold Covington, who lived in Santa Fe in a new house and wore a frock coat, and had the prosperous, impatient manner of a man who had converted his inheritance into ambition and was in the process of converting his ambition into money. Harold had given Clyde the bundle of letters and the instructions with the air of a man disposing of a minor inconvenience. "The house is empty," he had said. "I haven't been out there in 2 years. The letters are old and sentimental, no legal value. Burn the lot and be done with it. I'll pay you $50 when you bring me the ashes." He had not mentioned Gertrude. Clyde was fairly certain Harold did not know she was there. He fell asleep to the sound of the wind coming off the Sangre de Cristo Mountains and dreamed of nothing at all, which was, for him, a luxury. In the morning, Gertrude was already up. He could smell coffee and something baking when he came in from the barn, and she had set a place at the table without ceremony. There was cornbread in a pan and dried apple preserves in a small crockery jar, and the coffee was, again, extraordinary. "You found provisions," he said. "I brought provisions," she corrected. "I have been living here 6 weeks, Mr. Donovan. I am not entirely improvident." "I didn't think you were," he said, and sat down, and they ate together in the early morning quiet with the light coming golden through the east window, and the territory spread out beyond the glass like a painting that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. She was, he discovered over the next hour, a woman of formidable intelligence and remarkable practicality. She had come back to the homestead after her father's death because she had nowhere else she particularly wanted to go. She had been teaching school in Albuquerque for 3 years, a position she had obtained through considerable effort and held through considerable stubbornness against the opinion of a school board that was not entirely convinced women should be teaching beyond the primary grades. She had left the position when a letter from her father's attorney in Harlan Creek had informed her that the estate was being settled and the house would be sold within the year. "I could not simply let it go without bearing witness," she said. She said it plainly, without drama, which made it land harder. "This house is where my father learned to be a man and where my mother learned to be brave and where I learned to read and think and want things. It seemed important to record that before it was gone." "What will you do with the record?" Clyde asked. "Keep it," she said. "Perhaps someday someone will want to know what the Covington family was and what they built here. Perhaps my own children someday, if I have any. Perhaps no one at all. But the record itself matters, independent of who reads it." He thought this was one of the most sensible things he had ever heard anyone say and told her so, and she looked surprised genuinely, briefly surprised as if she had not expected agreement. "Brother thinks it is morbid," she said. "Your brother," Clyde said carefully, "is trying to sell the land." "He is," she said, "and he will. I have made my peace with that. The land will go to someone new and they will build new things on it and the valley will continue, which is how it should be." She looked out the east window. "But the family story should not be burned. That is the one thing I cannot accept." Clyde looked at the bundle of letters on the shelf. "What if I took them," he said, "back with me? I could say I burned them and bring you the letters instead. Your brother will never know." She looked at him for a moment, and he saw the temptation move through her and then something firmer settle in its place. "No," she said. "I will not have you lie for me, and I will not hide. I am going to write to Harold myself and tell him the letters still exist and that I am taking them with me when I go. I am going to tell him they are not his to burn because they were not written to him and not addressed to him, and they contain nothing that affects the sale of the property." "He won't like that," Clyde said. "No," she agreed. "He will not, but he is not a bad man, my brother. He is a frightened man. He wants everything settled and clean and finished because he doesn't know what to do with things that carry weight." She paused. "He will bluster and threaten to send someone out here to do what you wouldn't do, but in the end he will let it go. He always does. And if he doesn't," she looked at Clyde with those gray stormwater eyes and said, "then I will handle it." He believed her entirely. He was supposed to leave that morning. He had told himself he would confirm the situation, make a decision about the letters, and ride back. He stayed another day, and then another, and then a third, and each morning he found some honest reason why leaving that particular day was impractical, and each evening he sat at the kitchen table across from Gertrude Covington while she wrote, and he repaired small things around the house. A hinge on the back door, a loose board on the porch step, A cracked windowpane that he replaced with oilskin and meant to replace properly but didn't have the glass for, and they talked. They talked about everything, and nothing in the way that people talk when they are discovering each other without meaning to. When every ordinary conversation has a secondary layer of revelation underneath it. He told her about his family in Missouri, about coming west when he was 19, about the years he spent driving cattle and then dispatch work and then courier work, about a woman in Tucson he had nearly married and had not, for reasons he could not entirely explain to himself even now. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual in his experience, and when he was finished she said, "What do you want from your life, Mr. Donovan?" No one had asked him that in a very long time. He thought about it properly. "Something that stays put," he said finally. "I have been moving since I was 19 and most of it has been by choice and most of it has been good, but I think I am ready for something that doesn't require saddling up every 3 days." "Land?" she asked. "Maybe land," he said, "or maybe just a place, a direction." She nodded slowly. "I understand that," she said. "I have been moving too, not the same way you have, not so many miles, but internally. I have been trying to figure out where I am supposed to point myself." She looked at her pages. "Coming back here has helped. I think I needed to face this place directly and say goodbye properly before I could figure out where to go next. And have you figured it out?" She smiled then, just briefly, just enough. "I am getting closer." On the 4th day, a rider came. Clyde saw him from the porch, where he was replacing the oilskin on the window with a proper pane of glass. He had ridden the 8 miles to the small settlement of Cimarron, crossing to Purchase. The rider was coming from the south, not the direction of Harlan Creek, and he was moving fast. He dismounted at the fence post and tied his horse, and came up the path with the look of a man delivering news he wasn't entirely comfortable with. His name was Robert Tate, and he worked at the land office in Harlan Creek, and he was 25 years old and visibly nervous in the presence of Gertrude Covington, which Clyde noted and filed away without comment. "Miss Covington," Robert said, holding his hat in both hands, "I'm real sorry to bring this out to you personally, but the thing is, Mr. Harold Covington arrived in Harlan Creek yesterday evening. He's at the Settlers Hotel. He's planning to come out here tomorrow morning." Gertrude set down the paint scraper she had been using on the porch railing and looked at Robert with absolute composure. "Thank you, Robert. Did he say what he intended to do?" Said. Robert glanced at Clyde and then back at her. "He said he'd had information that the property was occupied and he wanted to sort it out in person." "Whose information?" Clyde asked. Robert looked at the ground. "Mrs. Feller at the dry goods store may have mentioned to someone that she'd sold provisions to a woman at the old Covington place." "Of course she did," Gertrude said, not unkindly. "Small towns were small towns in 1878 as in all years before and after." "All right." "Thank you, Robert. Would you like some coffee before you head back?" Robert declined, replaced his hat, and rode back south with the relieved energy of a man who has discharged a difficult duty. Gertrude and Clyde stood on the porch in the late afternoon light and looked at each other. "He'll want me to leave," she said. "He'll want the house empty for the buyer's inspection," Clyde said. "The buyer is already arranged. Harold mentioned a ranching family from Colorado when he gave me the commission. Name of Whitmore. They've been after this valley land for 2 years." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Well, I knew this was coming." She looked at the house, the door with its repaired hinge, the window with its new glass, the porch step with its solid new board. "I have almost everything recorded. I need perhaps 2 more days." Clyde looked at her. "You have 2 more days," he said. "I'll talk to Harold." She looked at him sharply. "You don't need to do that." "I know," he said, "but I will." Something complicated passed across her face. Something that was not quite gratitude and not quite something else but was moving in that direction. She said, "You are a very unusual man, Clyde Donovan." He had given up pretending to formality sometime around the 2nd day, and she had followed suit. He said, "I have been called worse." She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh. It was a quick, warm sound, like water over stones, and it surprised him enough that he laughed too. and for a moment they were just two people standing on an old porch in the fading New Mexico light, laughing at nothing in particular, and it was the finest thing he had felt in years. Harold Covington arrived the next morning at 10 o'clock on a rented horse from Harlan Creek, with a man named Peterson riding beside him, the kind of broad-shouldered, quiet man whose presence is itself a message. Harold was 43, running to weight, dressed in a city coat that was impractical for the territory, and that he knew was impractical, and wore anyway as a kind of statement. He had their father's jaw and none of their father's patience. He pulled up short when he saw Clyde on the porch. "Donovan," he said. "Mr. Covington," Clyde said. "Where are the ashes?" "There aren't any." Harold's jaw tightened. He dismounted heavily. "I hired you to do a job." "You hired me under false information," Clyde said, keeping his voice level and his hands loose at his sides. Peterson had gotten down too and was standing by the horses with a watchful expression. "You told me the property was vacant. It isn't. Your sister has been living here for 6 weeks, and the contents of this house are not abandoned property." "The house is in my name," Harold said. "I am the executor of the estate." "You are," Clyde agreed, "but you can't executor a woman's personal correspondence. Those letters were written by your mother and your grandmother, and they belong to your sister by any reasonable measure of human decency." Harold looked at him for a long moment. "This is not your business, Donovan." "Maybe not," Clyde said, "but here I am." The front door opened and Gertrude stepped out onto the porch. She had dressed deliberately that morning, a crisp white shirtwaist and her dark skirt brushed clean, her hair up properly, her manner carrying every ounce of the dignity she possessed, which was considerable. She looked at her brother with the expression of a woman who has been preparing for this conversation for 6 weeks. "Harold," she said. Harold looked at her and something moved through him, irritation, yes, but underneath it something older and more complicated, the residue of a shared history. "Trudy," he said, using the childhood name, whether deliberately or reflexively Clyde could not tell. "You should not be out here alone." "I am not alone," she said, and her eyes moved briefly to Clyde and away. "And I am perfectly capable of being alone if I choose to be, but more importantly, I need to speak with you. Come inside." Harold looked at Peterson, who stayed with the horses. He looked at Clyde, who moved aside but did not go away. He came up the steps and into the house. Clyde did not follow them inside. He sat on the porch step and listened to the territory and gave them their privacy. He could hear voices inside, Harold's louder, more frustrated, Gertrude's measured and consistent, but not the words. A scrub jay landed on the fence post and regarded him with professional suspicion. A hot wind came off the mesa and brought the smell of pine and dust together. The conversation lasted 35 minutes. Harold came out first. He stopped on the porch and looked at Clyde with an expression that was half annoyance and half something more complicated. "You're not getting paid," he said. "I know," Clyde said. Harold put his hat on. "She's leaving by the end of the week," he said. "The letters go with her. The buyer gets the property clear." He paused. "I want you to know that I am not an unreasonable man." Clyde said nothing. "She always did manage to make a person feel like a villain for wanting ordinary things," Harold said, almost to himself. Then he went down the steps and got on his horse, and he and Peterson rode south, back toward Harlan Creek, and did not look back. Gertrude appeared in the doorway. She leaned against the frame and looked after them and then looked at Clyde. "He agreed," she said. "I heard. He agreed because I made him remember what Mother would have thought of him burning her letters," she said. "He has a soft spot buried under a great deal of ambition, my brother. I know exactly where it is." Clyde looked at her. The morning light was bright and clean, and she looked like something permanent against the old doorframe, like she had always been there and always would be. "How much time do you have left?" he asked. 3 days of writing," she said. "Then I am done." "Then I'll stay 3 more days," he said. She looked at him for a long moment with those gray eyes doing everything gray eyes can do in the right light. "Why?" she asked. Not suspicious, not coy, just asking. "'Cause after 3 days you will be leaving," he said. "And I would like to know where you are going so that I know in which direction I might be going too." It was the most direct he had been with her. She heard it clearly. He watched her hear it. She said, "I am thinking about teaching again. There is a school in Las Cruces that is looking for someone with proper credentials. I wrote to them last month." "Las Cruces," he said. "It is a growing town," she said. "Good land nearby, reasonable people mostly." She looked at him steadily. "Do you know it? I've passed through," he said. "It seemed like a place worth stopping. A pause, a long one but not uncomfortable. The kind of pause that contains things too new to be said yet." "3 more days, then," she said, and went back inside to her writing. Those 3 days had a particular quality that Clyde thought about for a long time afterward, a kind of heightened ordinariness, as if every simple thing had been turned up slightly, made more vivid by the knowledge that the time was finite. He worked around the property in the mornings, doing the kind of maintenance that the house would benefit from even if the Whitmore family, not the Covingtons, would be the ones to benefit. He told himself this was just his nature. He was a man who could not leave a loose hinge unattended, but he knew it was also that working kept his hands busy while his mind arranged and rearranged the implications of what he was feeling. He had been in love before, once properly, with the woman in Tucson, though that had foundered on his inability to put down roots and her entirely reasonable requirement that he do so. A few other times in the smaller, less serious way that the road produces attachments to particular moments, particular laughs, particular sets of eyes seen across a saloon or a campfire. But this was different. This was someone who made him want to think clearly, who made him feel like the best version of his own mind was possible when she was talking, who made him want very much to know what she would think of every interesting thing he encountered for the rest of his life. He was aware that he had known her for 8 days. He was also aware that in 8 days he had spoken more honestly and been listened to more carefully than in the previous 8 years combined. In the evenings she read to him from what she had written, not seeking approval, just sharing, the way a person who makes something wants to have it heard by someone. She read him her grandmother's letters from Virginia, full of extraordinary tenderness and ordinary news, and the particular grace of a woman writing to a son she was afraid of losing to the wilderness. She read him her mother's letters to her father, the ones he had never read, which were full of a love so practical and so fierce that it was almost unbearable to sit still and listen to them without feeling something break loose inside you. She knew he was dying, Gertrude said after reading one of them. Her voice was even but her hands were very still on the pages. She knew, and she could not say it to his face, so she wrote it, everything she felt, everything she wanted him to know. She put it all in letters and folded them and addressed them and never sent them. Clyde thought about that. Where did she keep them? In the cedar box in the bedroom. She looked up. The box Harold wanted to burn. He thought about Harold on his horse riding away. He didn't know what was in them, he said. He really didn't know. No, she said. He made himself not know. There is a difference, but it is a forgivable difference. She set the letter down. I think he was afraid of feeling things he did not know how to manage. That is most people, Clyde said. She looked at him directly. Are you afraid of that? He met her eyes. I used to be, he said. I think I'm becoming less so. The lamp between them was very small, and the night beyond the windows was very large, and they were sitting close enough across the table that he could have reached out and covered her hand with his, which was exactly what he wanted to do and did not yet do. She said, quietly, "Good." On the second to last evening, they walked out to the creek. It was her suggestion. She said she wanted to see it one more time in the evening light, the way she had seen it as a child, in the long western shadows when the cottonwoods caught the gold and the water went silver between the banks. They walked side by side through the dry grass, not touching, not quite. The creek was everything she had said it would be. The cottonwoods stood massive and trembling with wind, their leaves flickering silver green, and the water ran shallow and cold over pale stones. The shadows were long and warm, and the sky above the mesa was beginning to color in the west, rust and amber and a high clear blue. Gertrude stood at the bank with her arms folded, not against cold but as if she were holding something, and looked at the water for a long time. He stood beside her and let her look. "My father used to bring me here on Sunday mornings," she said. "We would sit on that rock." She pointed to a flat-topped boulder on the near bank. "And he would tell me stories about the territory before the settlers came, about the Pueblo people and the Spanish before them, and the Apache who held these mountains for generations before anyone else arrived." She paused. "He said this land had more history than it would ever get credit for. That the story of the West was really the story of layered lives, one on top of another, and you had to be careful not to mistake the top layer for the whole thing." "He sounds like he was a thoughtful man," Clyde said. "He was the best man I knew," she said simply. "Until recently." He turned to look at her. She was looking at the water, but there was something in the set of her profile that was deliberate, a chosen moment. He said very quietly, "That is a generous thing to say." She turned to look at him. They were standing very close. The evening light was doing extraordinary things to everything around them, turning the ordinary world into something ceremonial, and he thought later that it was the kind of light that made people brave. "I am not particularly known for generosity," she said. "I am known for precision, so take it as such." He reached out and covered her hand where it rested in the fold of her arm, and her fingers opened and closed around his. And they stood like that at the edge of the creek in the last light with the cottonwoods moving above them, and neither of them said anything for a long time because nothing needed to be said yet, and some things say themselves better in silence. When they walked back to the house, they walked closer together. Not touching beyond the hands still loosely connected between them, but closer, with the quality of closeness that is the first form of a promise. The last full day was its own kind of bittersweet. Gertrude finished her writing in the morning. She reached the final page of the final letter and set her pen down and sat very still for a moment. And Clyde, who was refilling the wood box by the fire, stopped what he was doing and looked at her and did not speak. She gathered the pages into order, tapped them square, and tied them with the piece of ribbon she had used to mark her place. She carried them to the cedar box in the bedroom and laid them on top of everything already there, and she closed the lid with both hands and stood with her palms flat on the wood for a moment. "Done," she said. "Done," he agreed from the doorway. She turned and looked at him. Her eyes were bright, not from tears exactly. She was not a woman who cried easily or often, but with the particular brightness that comes from the completion of something that mattered. "Will you help me carry the box to the wagon?" she asked. He had hired a small wagon from Cimarron Crossing for her, because the idea of her trying to manage a cedar box and her trunk and all the rest of her things on horseback had seemed impractical to the point of stubbornness. She had argued that she was perfectly capable of managing. He had pointed out that there was no argument about capability, only about practicality. She had conceded the point, which he suspected cost her something, and which he appreciated accordingly. They spent the afternoon loading the wagon with the careful, methodical precision of people who are trying to make something last. Each trip back into the house felt like a small ceremony of departure. A final look at the empty shelf where her books had been. A last touch to the kitchen table that had held more meals and more words than either of them would ever know. At one point, carrying a box of kitchen provisions to the wagon, she stopped in the doorway and turned around and looked at the kitchen one more time, and he stopped behind her and waited. "The first thing I remember," she said, "is sitting on that floor with my mother while she rolled biscuit dough. I was perhaps 3 years old. She let me press my hand into the dough and the impression stayed. She baked it exactly like that with my small handprint in the top, and she laughed about it for days." He said nothing. There was nothing to say. He just stood behind her and let her have the memory. She turned around. She was very close. She looked up at him. She was not a short woman, but he was a tallish man, and she said, "Thank you for staying." "Thank you for letting me," he said. It was nearly dark when they finished loading. They stood by the wagon with the locked house behind them, the keys resting in Gertrude's palm to be left with the land office in Harlan Creek in the morning. The evening star was coming up over the mesa. Somewhere in the scrub, a nighthawk was beginning its complaint. Clyde said, "I want to ask you something, and I want to be clear that there is no pressure in this question. I am asking it honestly, and whatever the answer is, I will respect it." She looked at him with steady attention. "All right. I would like to accompany you to Las Cruces," he said. "Not just as far as the trail, I mean to Las Cruces. I mean with some intention of staying in that area, if the town is what I think it might be. I mean," he paused. He was, despite the directness of his nature, finding this harder to assemble than he had anticipated. "I mean that in the past 9 days I have found something I did not know I was looking for, and I am not entirely willing to saddle up and ride in the opposite direction from it." The evening star was quite bright now. Gertrude Covington looked at him for a long time. "The school board in Las Cruces is likely to have opinions about a schoolteacher who arrives with a man she is not married to," she said. "I'm aware of that," he said. "I'm not suggesting anything improper should occur," she added, with a precision that was almost but not quite prim. "I'm not suggesting it either," he said. "I am suggesting that we travel to Las Cruces with appropriate propriety, and that I find work there, and that we see each other with the regularity that two people might maintain when both of them are in the same town and both of them are interested in the direction things might go." She considered this. "That is," she said, "a very methodical courtship proposal." "I am a methodical man," he said, "when it matters." She looked at the keys in her hand and then at the house and then at him. "Yes," she said. "You may accompany me to Las Cruces." He breathed out. He had not realized how hard he'd been holding that. "Though I drive my own wagon," she added. "Wouldn't have it any other way," he said. They left the Covington homestead the next morning at first light, Gertrude on the wagon with the cedar box and her trunk carefully secured in the bed and her horse Maple tied behind, and Clyde on his mare Tally, riding alongside. They took the road through Harlan Creek to deposit the keys and arrange the final paperwork, which Gertrude managed with complete briskness and no visible sentimentality, though Clyde noticed she did not look back at the land office as they rode out of town south. He looked back for her. The road to Las Cruces from Harlan Creek was 3 days by wagon, more than 200 miles of territory that was by turns gorgeous and difficult and always vast. They traveled through scrubland and pinyon forest and stretches of pale caliche flat that went on so long the horizon seemed to recede as they moved, and everywhere the sky above the Jemez and the Sacramentos and the Organ Mountains was the particular blue of a place that has too much of it and doesn't apologize. The first day, they talked about everything about the territory's history, about the cattle wars that had torn through Lincoln County just that year and left their marks on the landscape and the people, about the railroad that everyone said was coming and what it would mean for the small towns that had organized themselves around the old freighting routes. She knew more about the politics of it than he did and held firmer opinions, and he found himself arguing positions he half believed just to have the pleasure of hearing her take them apart. "You are playing devil's advocate," she said, around midday, when he had advanced a particularly weak position about water rights. "I might be," he admitted. "You should know that I am very good at recognizing it," she said. "I taught school for 3 years. I have seen every form of intellectual game playing available to a human mind under the age of 17. "I'm 31, he said. "The behavior scales up," she said, and they both laughed, and the wagon rolled on south into the afternoon. That night they camped at a spot he knew, a place where a spring came up through the rock and the grass stayed green through the dry season, and the fires of other travelers had left a good ring. She cooked efficiently and without fuss, and they ate sitting on the ground near the fire with the horses picketed in the grass and the stars coming out overhead like something rehearsed. "Tell me about the woman in Tucson," she said. He looked at her. She was poking the fire with a stick, not looking at him, and her tone was entirely conversational. "Her name was Ruth," he said. "She was 26, the daughter of a hardware merchant. I met her the winter I spent in Tucson running dispatch for a freighting company. He thought about how to say it. We were compatible in many ways. She was smart and funny and kind. She wanted a house and a husband who came home on schedule and a garden, and I thought I could give her that, and I could not. Why not? Because I kept leaving, he said. Not because I didn't want what she was offering, but because I could not make myself believe that I was the right person to stay. That I was. He stopped. Enough, Gertrude said quietly. He looked at her. That is what you are trying to say, she said. That you were not sure you were enough to justify staying in one place. That moving felt safer than the risk of being fully seen and found wanting. He was quiet for a moment. That is more precisely put than I could have managed, he said. I have the same affliction, she said. In a different form. I have moved from position to position, town to town, situation to situation, always with excellent professional reasons, always telling myself it was practicality, always. She tapped the fire stick on the ground. Always running a little ahead of the possibility of being known completely. And now, he said. She looked at him across the fire. And now I have spent 9 days being known more completely than I have in 9 years, and I find I am less frightened of it than I expected. The fire was low and the stars were very bright, and he said, I find that too. She said, good. The second day was harder going. The road degraded in the afternoon into a rocky track that required Gertrude to concentrate on the wagon, standing the rough sections with a driver's easy authority that clearly came from years of managing teams in difficult country. He watched her handle the horses with admiration and some additional feeling that he was choosing not to examine too precisely. They stopped in the small settlement of Rincon, which sat in the Rio Grande Valley and had a proper inn with 2 rooms and a dining room where a Mexican woman named Senora Vega served the best enchiladas Clyde had eaten since the last time he had been in this part of the territory. Gertrude ate with visible pleasure and asked Senora Vega for the chili recipe with a directness that made the older woman laugh and offer instead to teach her in person. We are only staying 1 night, Gertrude said regretfully. Come back, Senora Vega said, with the easy certainty of someone who had no doubt. People always come back through Rincon. After dinner, they sat on the inn's small porch and looked at the Rio Grande, which was lower in October than it would be in spring, but still moving with purpose through the cottonwood corridor. The evening air was cool and smelled of water and wood smoke, and the particular sharp sweetness of fallen leaves. I need to tell you something, Gertrude said. She was looking at the river. All right, he said. I wrote a letter to Harold before we left Harlan Creek, not just about the property. She paused. I told him about you. Clyde looked at her. What did you tell him? That you were a good man and that you had treated me with complete respect and that I intended to see more of you in Las Cruces. She looked sideways at him quickly. I thought he should know from me rather than from anyone else's account. How do you think he'll respond? He will send a letter asking impossible questions about your financial prospects and your family background, she said. And when I write back that both are perfectly adequate and that the information is in any case more mine to evaluate than his, he will subside. Clyde thought about Harold and his city coat and his ambition and the soft spot she had found so precisely. You manage him well, he said. I have had 43 years of practice, she said. Though admittedly the first few years I was not yet very skilled. He smiled. She smiled. The river went on. He wanted to kiss her. He had wanted to for several days now, with increasing specificity. But there was something about Gertrude Covington that required a person to go slowly, not from timidity but from respect. She was a woman of considerable internal architecture, and you did not rush the process of understanding it, and he did not want to abbreviate anything by going faster than was proper. He said, Tell me what you hope for, from Las Cruces, from the teaching, he paused, from the next year. She thought about it carefully, the way she always thought about things, with her full attention. I hope the school is what the letter suggests, she said. Proper building, adequate books, students who are present because families value education, not just because there is nowhere else to put children during planting season. She smiled slightly. I hope to have a room of my own with a desk and enough light and enough quiet that I can continue writing, not just the family history, other things. I have been thinking about writing something larger, the history of this valley properly. The full history, all the layers, the way my father described it. A book, he said. Perhaps, she said, perhaps eventually. And the rest, he said, beyond the professional. She looked at him directly. I hope to be less alone, she said, with perfect plainness. I have been alone a great deal, and I have been good at it, and I do not apologize for it, but I think I would prefer to be less so. He reached over in the dark on the porch of the Rincon Inn above the Rio Grande and took her hand. She turned her hand over and held his back, and they sat like that for a long time, watching the river in the dark. Las Cruces announced itself first as a line of cottonwoods along the Rio Grande, and then as the adobe walls and wooden storefronts of a town that was, in the fall of 1878, actively growing. There were 2 churches, a new courthouse, a mercantile and a hardware store and a bakery, and 3 saloons arranged along the main street with the pragmatic democracy of a frontier town that has decided not to choose between civilization and commerce. The new school building sat on a proper lot on the northeast edge of town, red brick and glass windows, and a bell that had been rung that morning, and that Gertrude could hear as they drove in, and that she greeted with the expression of a woman receiving very good news. The school board chairman was a man named Thomas Hargrove, who was 55, and had the demeanor of a man who had seen enough of the territory to be impressed only by competence. He met with Gertrude for 1 hour in his office above the mercantile and came out shaking her hand with the firm relief of a man who has been looking for something and has found it. She starts Monday, he told Clyde, who had been waiting on the street outside with the horses. I gathered, Clyde said. Gertrude came out with a small smile of satisfaction that she was controlling carefully and said, I have a position and a boarding house address and a map to the market. All that remains is finding a place to put the cedar box. The boarding house was run by a woman named Mrs. Adiz Akafor, a Nigerian woman who had come to the territory 15 years earlier with her husband, who had worked as a surveyor for the Railroad Survey until his death 3 years ago, and who ran the cleanest and best organized boarding establishment in Las Cruces. She was 50 and had the observational precision of a woman who has spent years assessing strangers quickly and accurately, and she looked at Gertrude and then at Clyde and said, with serene directness, You 2 are not married. No, Gertrude agreed. Are you intending to be? Gertrude said, Remains under discussion. Mrs. Akafor looked at Clyde. He met her gaze. She appeared to take the measure of him in about 4 seconds, which he found both efficient and slightly unnerving. The teacher's room is upstairs at the back, she said to Gertrude. It has a desk and 2 windows and the light is good in the morning. Your gentleman friend can take the room at Calloway's on the next street, which is clean and reasonable. That suits us, Clyde said. Good, said Mrs. Akafor. Dinner is at 6, and I do not hold the pot. Clyde found work within the first week, which surprised him slightly, and would not have surprised him at all if he had thought about it more carefully. He had 12 years of territory knowledge, fluency in Spanish acquired over those years through necessity and genuine interest, and the kind of practical competence with horses and loads and routes that every freighting and courier operation in a growing town needed. He was hired by a man named Augusto Rivera, whose freighting company moved goods between Las Cruces and El Paso and north to Socorro, and the work was regular and the pay was honest, and crucially it was mostly local. He was home more nights than not. Home meaning, for now, his room at Calloway's. Though the word already felt inadequate, he saw Gertrude every evening. They ate dinner at Mrs. Akafor's table, which accommodated 6 boarders, and the conversations that developed there were among the most interesting Clyde had engaged in since coming west. Mrs. Akafor herself was formidably educated, and had opinions about everything from territorial politics to the railroad to the new telegraph line that stretched from El Paso north. and she deployed these opinions with the calm certainty of a woman who had not survived 15 years in the New Mexico territory by being diffident. The other boarders were equally various. A young surveyor named Felix, who was 22 and worshipful of Gertrude in a puppy-like way that Clyde found more amusing than threatening. A dressmaker named Cora, who had been in Las Cruces for 8 years and knew everything about everyone, and an elderly German prospector named Wilhelm, who spoke very little and ate a great deal, and occasionally, without warning, sang old German songs in a magnificent bass voice. It was, Clyde thought, a genuine household. It was the kind of thing he had not had since he left Missouri at 19. He courted Gertrude Covington with the methodical attention he had promised, and with a great deal of the genuine feeling that surprised him daily by the depth of it. He brought her books from the small lending library that had opened in the back of the mercantile. He fixed small things around the boarding house with the same irresistible handyman instinct that had led him to repair the Covington homestead, and Mrs. Acaffer regarded this with approval while pretending not to notice it. He rode with Gertrude on Sunday mornings when the school week was done, and she needed to move and think at the same time, and they covered the country around Las Cruces in every direction, into the Organ Mountains and down along the river, and across the flat desert west of town, where the creosote stood in its infinite patient rows. She was brilliant at her work. He heard this from everyone, from Thomas Hargrove, from the parents of her students, from the students themselves, 3 of whom he encountered one afternoon when he was coming back through town, and who stopped him in the street to announce, with the earnest accuracy of children, that Miss Covington was the best teacher the school had ever had. "She makes us write," one of the boys said, with an expression that contained equal parts complaint and pride. "She does," Clyde agreed. "A lot. Every day," the boy said. "She says writing is how you find out what you think." Clyde thought about Gertrude at the kitchen table in the old homestead, writing in the lamplight, racing against something. "She's right," he said. He asked her to marry him in December, 3 months after they arrived in Las Cruces, on a Sunday morning in the Organ Mountains at the top of a trail they had ridden 6 times by then, and that had become their trail, the way particular places become particular to particular people. He had thought about the proposal a great deal, and had decided on directness, which was his natural mode anyway, and which was the only mode she fully trusted. He had no ring yet, partly because he had not found one he thought was right, and partly because he suspected Gertrude's opinion of the right ring would be specific and better consulted in advance. They were sitting on a flat rock at a view that went 50 miles in 3 directions, and he said, "I want to ask you to marry me. And I want to be clear that I have thought about this very carefully, and that I am asking because I am certain of what I want, and I believe you are too, but also because I want to give you the full space to answer however you genuinely want to answer, and not however you think I want you to answer." She looked at him with the gray storm-water eyes that he now knew in all their weathers: the amused gray, the thinking gray, the moved gray, the sad gray, the sleeping gray in lamplight when she was tired and still beautiful, and she said, "That is the most precisely qualified marriage proposal I have ever heard." "Have you heard many?" he asked. "2," she said, "both considerably less thoughtful." "And your answer to those?" "No," she said, "both times. And this time," she looked at the 50-mile view. The mountains were hazed blue in the distance, and the Rio Grande was a silver thread below, and the desert was its ancient, unchanging self in every direction. She looked at all of it, and then she looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Clyde Donovan, my answer is yes." He kissed her then, for the first time properly, with his hands on her face and her hands on his coat lapels, and the winter wind moving around them and the mountains watching, and it was the most natural thing that had ever happened to him in his life, which is the only way a first kiss should ever be. They were married in January 1879 in the Las Cruces church, a small ceremony because Gertrude wanted it simple, and Clyde had no objection to simple. Mrs. Acaffer stood as her witness and wore a magnificent green dress and cried in the precise, efficient way she did everything. August Rivera stood for Clyde, because in 3 months they had become actual friends, which surprised Clyde and delighted Augusto. Felix, the young surveyor, played guitar badly at the reception, which was held at Mrs. Ockhaffer's, and which was attended by half the town because Gertrude's students had apparently told everyone, and the people of Las Cruces had decided this constituted a community event. Harold Covington sent a letter. It arrived the week before the wedding. It was formal at first, with the careful phrasing of a man working up to something, and then it broke open in the last paragraph and said, "I am glad you found him, Trudy. I am sorry about the letters. Father would have liked him. I think Mother would have too. Come and see me when you can." Gertrude cried when she read it, just briefly. She folded the letter and put it in the cedar box with everything else. The cedar box sat in the corner of their bedroom, in the house they rented on Mesquite Street. A proper house, 3 rooms, with a porch on the south side and a good-sized yard that Gertrude had plans for that involved a kitchen garden and possibly chickens, the chickens being a point of ongoing negotiation. Clyde had a particular opinion about chickens, which was that they were without exception the most stupid and unreasonable animals he had ever encountered. Gertrude had pointed out that this was irrelevant to their productivity as egg providers. He had admitted this was technically true. They planted the garden in March. Gertrude's plan for it was ambitious. She had spent the winter sketching it on paper the way she did everything, with precise measurements and careful notation about what grew where based on the sun angle and the water access. They worked in the mild spring evenings after she was done at school and he was back from his roots, kneeling in the turned soil together, and there was something about the work that was different from everything else, more grounded, more physical, more directly tied to the future in a way that neither of them said out loud but both of them felt. "My father's garden in Harlan Creek had peonies," she said one evening, pressing seeds into the row she'd prepared. "My mother used to say they were impractical in the high desert, but she kept them anyway." "Are we planting peonies?" he asked. She looked up with a small smile. "I wrote to a nursery in Albuquerque about them," she said. The peonies arrived in April, 6 bare-root plants wrapped in burlap, and Clyde planted them along the south fence while Gertrude supervised from the porch with the practical authority she brought to all supervised operations. And they took root and put up their first green shoots by May, and Gertrude regarded this with visible satisfaction every single morning. In April, she also told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, over coffee, in the same direct way she told him everything. She had suspected for 3 weeks and confirmed it through Mrs. Ockhaffer's practical network of women's knowledge and the advice of Dr. Nolan, Las Cruces' physician, who had seen her that afternoon. She set her cup down and said, "I have news." He looked at her. Something in her face, not the composure she habitually wore, but something underneath it, something more exposed and wondering, told him before she spoke. "We are going to have a child," she said. "Dr. Nolan believes December." He got up from his chair and crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her, and she leaned into him, which she did rarely and which therefore always landed in his chest like a bell struck clean, and he held her in the morning light in their kitchen on Mesquite Street and thought that some things were too large for words, and this was one of them. "December," he said into her hair. "December," she confirmed against his shoulder. He pulled back and looked at her face. She was watching him with the wondering look still, the composure not quite reassembled, and she looked for a moment very young, not young in the sense of inexperience, but young in the sense of new, as if this thing had opened a door in her she hadn't known was there. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Tremendously," she said. "Are you?" "Yes," he said honestly. She smiled. "Good. We can be frightened together, which is considerably better than being frightened separately." He laughed and she laughed, and the morning kept going around them. The summer of 1879 was vivid and hot and full. Gertrude taught through to July, and then finished her school year, and spent the remaining weeks of summer continuing the book she had begun writing, which had grown considerably from its initial conception as a family history, and was now a genuine account of the Rio Grande Valley from the pre-Columbian period through the present day, the Pueblo peoples, the Spanish Entrada and its consequences, the Mexican period, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, the territory years, the Anglos arriving, the Apache resistance, the railroad coming, all of it in the careful layered prose of someone who had been told since childhood that history was not a single story but a stack of them. She wrote at the desk in their bedroom in the mornings, before the heat built, and he could hear the scratch of her pen sometimes when he was in the kitchen making coffee, and it was one of the best sounds he knew. He had extended his work with Augusto Rivera into something more of a partnership. He knew enough routes and enough people now to bring in work that Augusto hadn't had before, and the business had grown enough that they had 2 additional drivers and a proper freight yard. He was building something, he realized. Not just doing work that moved him forward to the next place, but actually building a thing that would be there tomorrow and the week after and the year after. And it was different from everything he had done before in a way that continued to surprise him by being not confining, as he had always feared, but solidifying, like ground that has finally decided to hold. Thomas Hargrove stopped him on the street in August and said, "I want you to know that Mrs. Donovan is the finest teacher this school has had, and I intend to make sure she knows that formally before she begins her leave." "I'll tell her you said so," Clyde said. "Tell her I mean it," Hargrove said. "And tell her there is a position waiting when she's ready to come back. I don't care when that is. She can take 6 months or a year. The position will wait." Clyde told her that evening, sitting on the south porch watching the last light on the Organ Mountains, his hand on the curve of her belly where their son was moving. They had decided not to call it anything but themselves knew somehow that it was a son, and she was quiet for a moment and then said, "I am very grateful to be somewhere that values the work." "You make it easy to value," he said. She looked at him sidelong. "That is a very diplomatic way of saying I am good at what I do." "You are excellent at what you do," he said. "I am not known for diplomacy." "You are better at it than you think," she said. Then, after a moment, "I want to go back to teaching in the spring, perhaps a reduced load at first." "Whatever you want," he said. "That is a statement that will not always be practical," she pointed out. "I know," he said. "I'm making it while it is." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she did slightly more often these days, as if the pregnancy had loosened something in her carefully maintained self-sufficiency, and they sat in the evening and watched the mountains turn from gold to rose to the deep purple gray. That was the last thing the day did before it gave it up entirely. The child was born on December 14, 1879, during a cold that came off the mountains overnight and put ice on the water barrel and frosted the windows of the house on Mesquite Street. Dr. Nolan came at midnight, and Mrs. Acaffer came because Gertrude had asked her, and because Mrs. Acaffer was not the kind of woman who needed to be asked twice for something important. Clyde sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and paced and drank more coffee and tried to read and failed and was very grateful around 3 in the morning when Mrs. Acaffer came out and said, "A boy, a healthy boy, come see." He was named Martin James Donovan Martin for her father, James for his, and he had Gertrude's gray eyes from the very first day, though Dr. Nolan said eyes changed. And Clyde had the feeling that Martin's would not because he already looked at the world with a steady, assessing directness that was entirely his mother's. Gertrude held him with the same focused deliberateness she brought to everything and looked at his face in the lamplight and said, "Well, Martin, here you are." Martin regarded her with the gray eyes. "He has your look," Clyde said from beside her. "He has your jaw," she said. "He has his own face," Clyde said. "He'll figure out the rest." She smiled, not the small controlled smile she usually deployed, but something larger, less managed, entirely new. She was 28 years old and she was exhausted and beautiful and holding the child that was theirs. And Clyde Donovan sat on the edge of the bed in the cold December bedroom and thought that some things are too perfectly right to have been planned, and this was one of them. The winter was domestic and good. Martin was a focused, somewhat serious baby who regarded the world with considerable attention, and cried mostly when he had specific needs that he expressed with communicative urgency, which Gertrude said was entirely appropriate, and she had no patience for the idea that babies should simply be endured. She was an entirely practical mother. She read him books from the first week, reasoning aloud that the content was less important than the habit, and she kept notes on his development with the same precision she brought to everything else, which the doctor found unusual and Clyde found entirely characteristic. She went back to teaching in March, on the reduced schedule she had planned, and the arrangement with Mrs. Acaffer to look after Martin during school hours worked smoothly, because Mrs. Acaffer had been managing the practical demands of the world for decades and found a single-focused infant considerably less challenging than most things she had managed. Gertrude's book grew through that year and into the next. She submitted the first 3 chapters to a publisher in St. Louis in the fall of 1880 and received a letter back in November that said, among other things, that the work was remarkable and that they would like to see the complete manuscript. She read the letter at the kitchen table with coffee and Martin in her lap because he was a year old now and preferred to be where the interesting things were, and she set the letter down and said, simply and quietly, "They want it." Clyde was at the table across from her. He said, "Of course they want it." "You haven't read it," she said. "I've heard you read from it many times," he said. "It's remarkable, Gertrude." She looked at the letter and then at him. "It's everything my father told me," she said. "It's everything he knew about this place. She paused. "I wrote it down." "You wrote it true," he said. "That's the harder part." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He turned his hand over and held it. Gertrude Covington came to visit in the spring of 1881. He arrived on the train. The Southern Pacific Line had reached Las Cruces in 1881, bringing with it the noise and speed of a world that was reshaping itself around rails. And Harold stepped off the platform in his city coat and looked around at the town with the expression of a man recalibrating expectations in real time. Gertrude met him on the platform. They stood looking at each other for a moment, and then Harold said, "You look well," with a sincerity that seemed to cost him something and that she received graciously. "You look tired," she said, with a directness that was also grace. He laughed. "Santa Fe will do that." Clyde shook his hand and saw in Harold's face the thing that men sometimes had when they met the man their sister had chosen, a complex assessment that involved loyalty and possessiveness, and the desire to be reassured that the right choice had been made. He gave Harold his steadiest, most honest look and saw Harold receive it and relax by a degree. They fed Harold dinner at their table, and Martin, who was 16 months old and had recently discovered the word "no" with profound enthusiasm, regarded his uncle with deep suspicion for approximately 10 minutes, and then decided he was acceptable and allowed himself to be picked up, which Harold managed with the careful inexperience of a man who has not held many babies and did not know he had been waiting to hold this one. Harold stayed 3 days. On the last evening, after Martin was in bed and Gertrude was in the kitchen and Harold and Clyde were on the south porch in the warm spring dark, Harold said, "I want to apologize for the letters," Clyde said. "That's between you and her." "I know," Harold said. "I'll say it to her too. I'm saying it to you because," he stopped, "because you could have burned them and gone home, and you didn't." "No," Clyde said. "Why not?" Clyde looked at the Oregon mountains, faint outlines in the dark, their peaks holding the last of the day's light. "Because she was still there," he said, "still writing them. It seemed important to pay attention to that." Harold was quiet for a moment. "She told me what she recorded," he said, "in those last letters she wrote. She said she wrote down everything, every story, every memory. Mother's letters, father's letters." He paused. "The letters Mother never sent." "Yes," Clyde said. "I didn't know about those," Harold said. "The ones Mother wrote when Father was dying, I didn't know they existed." "She couldn't give them to him," Clyde said. "She wrote them anyway." Harold was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That sounds like her, exactly like her." Before he left, Harold sat with Gertrude at the kitchen table while Clyde was out at the freight yard. And when Clyde came home, he found them still sitting there, the cedar box open between them. Harold reading their mother's letters with his city coat off, and his reading glasses on, and his face broken open in the way that faces break when they finally receive something they did not know they had been waiting for. Gertrude was across from him, not reading, just present, the way she was present for important things fully, without interference, without making it smaller. Clyde hung up his hat and went to the kitchen and made coffee and brought it in without announcement, and Harold looked up at him with eyes that were red and said, "Thank you," and meant it for everything. "There is coffee," Clyde said. Harold laughed, a wet, broken laugh that was better for being broken. Gertrude looked at Clyde across the cedar box and the letters and her brother's undone composure, and she looked at him with those gray eyes full of a love that was not showy and not small, and that had been growing steadily for 2 years in the specific direction of permanent. And he looked back at her, and knew the same thing was visible in his own face, and neither of them said anything because the thing that needed saying was already in the room. Harold left on the morning train with 2 of the copied letters folded in his breast pocket, copies Gertrude had made for him of their mother's handwriting, and he stood on the platform and put his hands on his sister's shoulders and said, "The valley was good land, Trudy." "It was," she said. "Father would have been glad of this," Harold said, meaning the town and the school and the book and the cedar box and Clyde and Martin all at once. "I know," she said, and hugged him properly, her arms around his stout city coat shoulders, and he held on for a moment before stepping back. He tipped his hat to Clyde, man to man, and got on the train. The years in Las Cruces moved the way good years do, not slowly, not quickly, but with the full texture of days that are actually being lived. Martin grew into himself steadily, gray-eyed and deliberate and given, from the age of 3, to the habit of collecting rocks and presenting them to people as if they were gifts of considerable value, which, Gertrude maintained, they were. She went back to full teaching in the fall after Martin's 2nd birthday, and brought a rigor and warmth to the classroom that continued to produce results that Thomas Hargrove described, at the annual school board meeting, as exceptional, and that Cora, the dressmaker, described at Mrs. Acker's dinner table as what happens when someone actually loves what they are doing, and that her students described, in the ongoing tradition of children encountering good teachers, as a lot of writing. Clyde's partnership with Augusto Rivera extended and grew. By 1882, they had 5 wagons running regularly between Las Cruces and El Paso and north to Albuquerque, and the arrival of the railroad had shifted their business, not eliminated it. The railroad moved bulk goods, but there was still an enormous amount of local freight that needed horses and men who knew the country, and Clyde knew the country as well as anyone. He had also, through the contacts he had built, begun to invest carefully in the land around Las Cruces, not with Harold's converting ambition energy, but with the patient accumulation of a man who wanted ground to stand on permanently, who had spent enough time moving to understand what it meant to stay. In 1883, Gertrude's book was published by the St. Louis Press under the title The Rio Grande Valley, A History of Its People and Its Land. It was reviewed in 3 newspapers, including the Santa Fe Daily New Mexican, which said it was the most thorough and admirably unsentimental account of this territory yet produced, written with a scholar's precision and a native's love. Harold sent a copy of that review with a note that said, simply, "Father would have been insufferable about this." She laughed so hard at the note that Martin, who was 3 and deeply concerned when laughter happened without him, came running in from the yard in alarm and had to be reassured that everything was excellent. The book's publication led to correspondence with several other historians and territorial newspapers, and Gertrude became known in a quiet but real way as someone whose opinion on the territory's history was worth having. She was asked to speak twice in Santa Fe, once at the Territorial Library and once at a gathering of educators from across New Mexico. And she prepared these talks with the same complete seriousness she brought to everything, and delivered them with a composed authority that Clyde, sitting in the audience, found simultaneously entirely expected and entirely wonderful. On the train back from Santa Fe after the second talk, sitting across from each other in the rocking car with Martin asleep across both their laps and the territory going dark outside the windows, Gertrude said, "I have been thinking about a second book." "Tell me," he said. She talked for an hour, the way she talked when an idea was alive in her, quickly, with the particular brightness that was her thinking face, tracing the outline of something about the Apache resistance and the injustice of the forced removals that had begun in earnest in the 1870s, the story of Victorio and his band and the Chiricahua, and the deliberate erasure of a people's claim to land they had held for centuries. She spoke about it with a controlled anger that he knew was the only form in which she expressed moral outrage, controlled but not diminished, precise but not cold. "The official records are full of the military perspective," she said. "I want to write the other side. Or as much of it as can be recovered." She paused. "My father told me that this valley had more history than it would ever get credit for. I think he meant this specifically. I think he meant the people who came before us and whose presence the newcomers preferred to overlook." "That will be a harder book to publish," he said. "Yes," she agreed, "I know. You'll do it anyway." She looked at him with the gray eyes. "Yes," she said, "I will." He took her hand across Martin's sleeping weight. "I'll be here," he said, "while you do it." She squeezed his hand once firmly, in the particular way she had that meant both thank you and of course. Their daughter was born in June 1884, on a hot blue morning when the roses Gertrude had eventually persuaded the yard to grow were in full bloom along the south fence, which seemed right. She was named Eleanor Ruth Donovan, Eleanor being a name Gertrude had always loved, Ruth for the woman in Tucson, which surprised Clyde when she suggested it and moved him deeply. "She deserves to be remembered well," Gertrude said when he asked. "She was a good woman who wanted good things. The fact that you could not give her what she needed did not make her less." He looked at his wife holding their daughter in the morning light. "You are a remarkable person," he said. "I am a precise person," she said. "There is a difference." "Gertrude," he said. She looked at him. "You are remarkable," he said. She allowed it. She smiled, looking down at Eleanor, and allowed it. Eleanor was everything Martin was not personality-wise, and everything Martin was in the ways that mattered. She was vivid and quick and laughed at everything, and followed Martin around the yard with a persistence that he initially resented and eventually found endearing. And she learned to talk at an age that alarmed Dr. Nolan mildly, and then chose to use this skill primarily to narrate everything she observed, which Martin bore with the stoic patience of an older sibling who understands that the universe does what it does. Mrs. Acaffer adored both children with a precise and practical love that was the same as her love for everything not sentimental, not excessive, but real and reliable and absolutely present when needed. She had become, over the years, something closer to family than neighbor, closer to grandmother than landlady, and the children addressed her as such, which she received with the dignified pleasure of a woman who has earned everything she has. In the fall of 1885, Gertrude began the research for the second book in earnest. She wrote letters to the Bureau of Indian Affairs and to territorial historians, and to surviving Apache elders when she could find names and locations. And she drove herself into the Mescalero country twice with Clyde beside her, both of them on horseback, to speak with people who had lived through the years she was writing about. These conversations were conducted through interpreters, with patience, with Gertrude's absolute attention, and without the condescension that she had seen in too many official accounts, and they produced testimony that she wrote into her notebooks in her small, precise hand, and that kept her at her desk late into the evenings. Clyde read the chapters as they came. He was an honest reader, and she wanted honest feedback, not approval, and he gave it to her straight. This section needs more context. This passage is strong. This transition doesn't work. This testimony is extraordinary. She received the criticism with the same directness she offered it, without defensiveness, without performance of consideration she didn't actually feel. It was, he thought, one of the finest things about their partnership, the honesty of it, the refusal to be comfortable at the expense of being real. Martin was 6 and Alina was 2 when the second book, which she titled Land Without Memory, A History of the Apache in the Rio Grande Valley, was finished. The St. Louis press that had published her first book took it, though with some hesitation about its political implications, and it was published in 1887 to considerably more controversy and considerably more attention than the first. The Santa Fe paper called it uncomfortable but necessary. A newspaper in Washington called it dangerously sympathetic. A letter from a Mescalero Apache man who had spoken to Gertrude during her research, written through an interpreter, said that it was the first time he had read his people's story told as if it were true. She kept that letter in the cedar box with all the others. On a Sunday morning in the fall of 1887, Clyde stood on the porch of the house on Mesquite Street, the house they had bought outright in 1884. The house with the peonies and the roses and the kitchen garden and the south-facing porch and the children's handprints pressed into the mortar of the garden wall from an afternoon 4 years ago, when someone who will not be named had let the children into the mortar bucket, and he watched Gertrude moving through the kitchen garden with a purpose that had no urgency in it, just the morning ease of a woman who has made a life she chose. She stopped at the cedar box. He knew this because he had seen it happen before. She passed the box, which sat now in the kitchen corner where the light caught it in the afternoon, and sometimes she stopped and put her hand on the lid for a moment, and he always knew when she had because there was something different in her face afterward, something both more and less. She came out to the porch with 2 cups of coffee and handed him his and sat in the second chair and looked at the mountains. "I got a letter from the university in Albuquerque," she said. "Yes," he said. "They are opening a proper history department. They want me to consider a lectureship." She drank her coffee. It would mean teaching at the university level, continuing to write. It would require moving to Albuquerque. He looked at the mountains. "What do you want to do?" he said. She looked at him. "What do you want?" she said. "You have the freight business here. Augusto." "Augusto has run it mostly himself for the last 2 years, Clyde said. "He is an excellent businessman and he doesn't need me standing over his shoulder. I have enough invested in this territory to produce income without a specific operation." He paused. "What I am asking is what you want, Gertrude." She was quiet for a moment. "I want to keep writing," she said. "I want to write a 3rd book. About the women of this territory, all of them. Not just the Anglo women, but the Mexican women and the Pueblo women and the women like Mrs. Acaffer who came here from other worlds entirely and built something anyway. I want to teach that history to people who will go and tell it further." She looked at the garden, the peonies dormant now in the November cool, the roses behind their winter wrapping of burlap. "And I want," she added more quietly, "to take the peonies." He laughed. She laughed with him, and it was the water-over-stone sound that he loved. That was, after 8 years, still the sound that made everything feel possible. "We'll take the peonies," he said. "And the cedar box," she said. "Of course the cedar box," he said. She reached across and covered his hand with hers where it rested on the arm of his chair, and he turned his hand over and held hers in the way that was by now as natural as breathing, as automatic and as vital. Martin came out the back door at this point, 6 years old and already wearing his coat because he had paid attention when people told him the morning was cold, holding one of the rocks from his collection in each hand with the solemn purpose of a small geologist. "Papa," he said, "which one is better?" He held up a flat red sandstone in his right hand and a piece of quartz crystal in his left. Clyde examined them both with the seriousness they deserved. "The quartz," he said, "but the sandstone has better color." Martin considered this. "I will keep both," he said, and went back inside. Gertrude was smiling with her coffee cup halfway to her mouth. "He gets that from you," Clyde said. "The practical resolution. He gets it from both of us," she said. They sat on the porch in the November morning light, and the mountains were clear and close in the cold air, and Alina could be heard inside insisting on something with the eloquent persistence of a 3-year-old who has decided that language is a lever. And Clyde Donovan looked at his life from the vantage of that porch, and thought about the match he had struck and dropped on the doorstep of the Covington homestead 9 years ago, in the lamplight, in the year that everything changed. He had come to burn the letters. She had been sitting there, still writing them. He had set the match down and walked into the light. It was, he thought, the best thing he had ever done. The move to Albuquerque happened in the spring of 1888. Organized with the precision that Gertrude brought to all relocations, and with the participatory chaos that 2 children aged 7 and 3 reliably introduce into any organized system. The cedar box was packed first and unpacked last, which was Gertrude's explicit instruction, and it sat in the front room of the new house, a good house, bigger than the Mesquite Street house, with a study for Gertrude that had 3 windows and a proper bookcase that Clyde built over the course of 2 weekends with the focused pleasure of a man who is good at building things, until everything else was settled around it. The peonies were transplanted with the help of their neighbor, a retired engineer named Carruthers who had opinions about soil composition that Gertrude engaged with genuine interest. They bloomed the following June, improbably and magnificently, as peonies do when they have decided to be well. Gertrude began her lectureship at the university in the fall of 1888 and found, to her pleasure, that it suited her precisely as well as she had hoped. The students were engaged, the faculty colleagues were various and interesting, and the library resources available to her for the 3rd book were considerably more extensive than anything Las Cruces could provide. She wrote with the focused intensity of someone who has found their full range of motion and is using it, coming to the dinner table some evenings still half in the century she'd been researching, and Clyde had learned to hand her coffee and ask a question that would bring her back gradually rather than all at once. Martin started school in Albuquerque and found, to his considered satisfaction, that his teacher used a great deal of writing and expected students to think. He wrote his mother a note about this, delivered formally across the breakfast table, which said, "My teacher says writing is how you find what you think." Gertrude read it and looked at Clyde and said nothing, but her eyes said everything. Alina, who had opinions about writing that were more complex than her brother's, preferring instead to be read to at maximum volume and frequency, became at the age of 4½ the primary audience for Gertrude's research readings, sitting on the study floor with her dolls, and listening with the half-attention of a small person who absorbs more than she appears to. Years later she would write history herself, and she would credit her mother, and she would credit also the afternoons on the study floor, the sound of Gertrude's voice reading the past into the room while Alina played and listened, and learned without knowing she was learning. On a December evening in 1889, the 10th anniversary of Martin's birth, and almost exactly 10 years from the morning Clyde had ridden south out of Harlan Creek with a bundle of letters and a lit match, Gertrude sat at the kitchen table of the Albuquerque house after the children were in bed and opened the cedar box. She took out the letters one by one and laid them on the table in order: the grandmother's Virginia letters, the mother's letters to the sister in Charleston, the father's letters about water rights and land in the shape of the valley, the mother's undelivered letters to the dying father, and the letters that Gertrude herself had written in those final weeks at the homestead, recording everything she remembered, and the letter from Harold, and the letter from the Mescalero man, and a few others accumulated in the years since letters from students, from readers, from the publisher in sent. Louis, from a woman in Albuquerque whose grandfather had known the Covington family in Harlan Creek, and who had written after reading the first book to say that she recognized everything in it and was glad it had been written down. Clyde sat across from her, watching her go through them. He did not speak. She went through each one slowly and carefully, not reading every word but renewing acquaintance with the handwriting, the paper, the particular weight of each letter. And when she had gone through the whole stack, she began to put them back, one by one, in the order she had taken them. When they were all back in the box, she closed the lid and put both hands on the wood and sat quietly for a moment. "Are you all right?" he asked. She looked up at him. The lamp between them was the same quality of amber light that there had been at the homestead kitchen table 10 years ago, and she looked different and the same, older in the ways that a person gets older when they have been actually living, more settled in her face, more fully herself. "I am wonderfully all right," she said. "I was thinking about my mother, about her sitting down to write a letter she knew she could not send. The courage of that. Of saying the true thing even when it cannot be heard because saying it is still worth doing." He thought about that. "Like writing books," he said. "Like everything that matters," she said. "You say it anyway. You write it down. You put it in a box, or you mail it, or you speak it across a kitchen table, and maybe it is received and maybe it is not, but the saying of it is real. The truth of it doesn't require reception to exist." He looked at her across the lamp in the cedar box, and 10 years of building a life that was fuller than either of them had known to want. "I received it," he said. She reached across and put her hand on the table between them, palm up. He put his hand in hers. They sat like that at the kitchen table in the December quiet, while their children slept and the cedar box held its 30 years of letters and the third book grew in the study down the hall, while the peonies slept under their winter mulch in the garden, and the Rio Grande ran in the dark 2 miles away, and the Sandia Mountain stood enormous and patient in the night. He had come to burn the letters. She had been still there, writing them. And from the dropped match and the lit lamp and the woman who did not look up right away, who kept writing until she was finished, from that had come this. The house and the children and the cedar box and the 10 years and the hands across the table and the lamp light. He would not have burned them, he thought. Not for anything. Not now, not then. The moment he had stepped through the door and seen her bent over the page in the amber light, the outcome had been fixed, though neither of them knew it yet. He had stepped into the light. She had kept writing. And they had built, in the particular way that two specific people build when they find each other at exactly the right moment in exactly the right place, something that would last. The letters were safe in their cedar box. The story was not finished. It was, in fact, just getting good.